Alright guys, welcome back to the final video in the Craftsman Pie Cupboard series. So in this one we're going to be working on the drawers that are going to go in our top section. So I've already gone through and milled out our stock. The only thing left to do with it is to go through and actually cut it to fit into our openings. So I cut our side pieces, so the pieces that are going to go from the front to the back, I've already cut them to length. And basically all I did with these ones is they all fit perfectly, except they are a little bit oversized, so they don't actually fit in the hole standing up. But the length is the exact length of that intersection minus 1/4 of an inch, which is going to be the 1/4 of an inch we're going to leave on our front for our half blind dovetail. And then so for our front sections, now what we need to do is, now that I have one end squared up on them already, I need to go through and fit them very tightly into the front opening gap of our cupboard. Now this is a very long and kind of painstaking process. It's all about taking material off very, very slowly here and trying to get a nice tight fit in there with minimal gaps around the outside edges. And so with one edge squared up, I'm just going to keep sneaking up on it to the table saw until I get close. Once I get about, a 1/16th to a 32nd of an inch close to being fitted, I'm going to go in and use my low angle jack and just slowly work back the grain on my shooting board to make sure we get a perfect piston fit. Because the problem with the table saw is it's very hard to remove a piece from a table saw, then bring it back and get an accurately small cut. It's very easy to accidentally slip and take too much off. So once I get close, I'll definitely go in and deal with it with the hand plane. But for now, because this is white oak and there's a lot of material still to remove, I gotta make sure that I go in and take it off with the table saw. And so before we get going with this video, you guys will notice that the pie cupboard is in a much different state than in the end of the last video. Now, if you guys are following along with the series, you'll probably understand what's going on. But right now, currently, I have the other doors. I've got one door glued up and I'm gluing up the other one at the moment. And that's why I'm taking the time to start on the drawers. But that's how these projects tend to roll. I tend to work on different things at different times, and sometimes they overlap. So if you guys are wondering why the pie cupboard in the video you guys last saw has doors attached to it and has a back panel and all that stuff, that's why we've gone back and we're just kind of rewinding in time while I work on these drawers. So that's... So anytime you're fitting drawers up like this, you want to make sure that you're starting with the end grain or the length of the drawer. The reason for this is because anytime you're cutting across the grain here, you have a very good chance of breaking out the fibers at the end. You can see on this piece how we've broken out all the fibers on the end here. But what's really good about it, if you just start with doing the cross grain cutting, is that when you do the with the grain cutting, or the ripping part of this, is you can usually clean up most of that, which then gives you a much better final look. Again, the bottom side doesn't really matter, but you want to make sure that when we start to take material off on the ripping part of this, that we take it all off the top so we clear off this little bit of tear out. And so at this stage of the game, you want a really tight fit. In the case of these pieces, I had to wiggle them a little bit to actually get them to fit in the area, and that's exactly perfect. You want them to be as perfect of a fit as they possibly can be. Because when you actually finish the drawers, they are going to be a little bit loose. There is going to be a small gap around the outside so that the drawers can grow and expand with wood movement. But at this stage, you want them as tight as possible. That way, when you go to cut your joinery, you can cut your joinery super accurately to fit in this space. And then with the excess that comes from cutting joinery, you're always going to have stuff either a little bit off center or a little bit off of kilter. You can go in and really square and straighten things up as best you can. And so right now we've got a good tight fit in here, and I've got plenty of room to take material off later on when I need to get these a little bit looser so they slide in and out. You can also see here that I cut both these pieces from the same piece of wood, so we get the nice grain flowing across here. Now, you don't have to do this, but it is something that will definitely set your piece apart from, other people's projects. And so I've also got all of our other drawer pieces. I cut them to the same height all at the same time when I had the table saw set up. And when I was cutting the heights for each of the pieces, I did each drawer at its own time to make sure that I got it as accurate as possible. Now both drawers are pretty much the exact same height, but there was a very minor variance. I'd say just about like a 64th of an inch variance between them, which is, perfectly understandable. Again, it's wood, it moves, it does its own thing. You have to work around it. So getting a perfect fit, you want to focus on one drawer at a time and get all your other pieces fit at the same time. Now there's a few different methodologies behind fitting drawers. Some people say you should leave your sides proud so that after you've cut your dovetails into them and fit everything up, you can then clean down your sides to be a perfect fit. I like to get everything to the exact same width, cut it all to their final lengths and all that, and then cut all my joinery. And then knowing that after I've cut my joinery, I need to thin it down a little bit more so that this thing will slide smoothly. Because again, like I mentioned, these drawer fronts are super tight in there. And so on our drawers, we're going to be using two different types of joinery. Basically the same type of joinery, but two different styles, more like it. And so on the front, we're going to be doing half-blind dovetails. Now, the nice part about half-blind dovetails is that you don't see it. So you get a nice clean front face, which again keeps our grain pattern going nice and clear. And so on the back piece, we're going to be going with through dovetails, which just means that the dovetail is going all the way through the piece. And there's not really any reason you could use half blind on the back too, but half blind are a little bit more time consuming just because they take a little bit extra time to cut out the material and clean up the material that's in the dovetail, and they have a little bit higher chance of failure. So you want to make sure that you doing them as little as possible, in my opinion. And so by doing through dovetails on the back, again, we can get them done nice and quick, clear them out really quickly and easily. And again, it's just a very easy thing to do. So half blind on the front, through on the back. Let's just get going with it because this is going to take a long time. I have done very few dovetails in oak, so this is going to be extra fun. So here's a really good trick for figuring out how to lay out your half-blind dovetails. So when you're marking your half-blind dovetails, you need to make sure that when you're cutting your tails, which is what you're supposed to do first, you mark down the proper depth. And so the way we're going to go about doing this is when I set my marking gauge, I could go ahead and do some math and figure out how far in I need to go to get the perfect 1/4 inch. Or the easiest way to do it is you can take a 1/4 inch setup block. Then you want to take your marking gauge, press it down onto your top piece, and push the plunger down so it rests nicely on that setup block. This will give you exactly a 1/4 inch of spacing on that front edge when you cut your dovetails in. Alright guys, so the drawers are all nicely fitted up now. I've got the sides and the backs all planed down to the proper thickness so that these slide in nice and easily. So we still have yet to actually put in the drawer runners, which are going to guide these things so they're still a little bit wobbly in there, but they fit through the main opening, which is all that we're going for right now. So now the last part of this is I need to clean up the front face. Now the problem here is that the front face has a little bit more complicated grain than the sides, and I genuinely care about the look of it more than I do about the sides and the back especially. So what I'm going to do here is, up until now I've been using a 40-degree blade in my low angle jack. So I'm going to be swapping that out for a 50-degree blade, and what this allows me to do is work the slightly more complicated grain a little bit better. And so with a low angle jack, the higher the blade angle, the better it cuts through more complicated wood, because it's a lot more like scraping. When you're using something like a card scraper, you can generally go over more complicated grain without damaging it. Again, you still have to somewhat follow the rules of grain direction when scraping, but it's a lot easier. You can go through a lot more complicated grain than you can with something like a normal hand plane blade. And so generally I found that I really like the 40-degree blade, and it's supposed to be a 38-degree blade, but I can't really sharpen to that with my sharpening system, so 40 degrees is much easier to consistently get back to. And so I like the 40-degree blade for kind of general work. I do use it for most of the stuff that I use a hand plane for in the shop. I like to use my 40-degree blade. I only generally go up to the 50-degree blade when I really want a good finish and I know that my pieces have a little bit of nastiness or weird curly grain to them. Then I go up to the 50. And so one of the things you need to make sure of anytime you're using a 50-degree blade is your piece is clamped securely to a solid surface. So right now I've got my shooting board clamped down to my workbench, overhanging so the drawer is hanging on it. Then I'm using this clamp here to clamp the side of the drawer in nice and tight to the shooting board so it's not moving around at all. Now you have to do this because a 50-degree blade, because it's much steeper, it does better in tough grain like we're dealing with here, but it also requires a lot more effort to push through that tough grain. Even no matter how sharp it is, it's always going to take more pressure and more effort than say a 25 or even a 40-degree blade. Alright, so we now have fully functional drawers, so we can actually pull these out and they don't go wobbling around and get stuck. So we can pull them out nicely and they'll They do tilt slightly, and that's kind of on purpose so that when you pull it out like this, it doesn't just come crashing down. It actually jams up on the upper rail here and stays locked in place. But now when you push it in, it also doesn't get stuck and it goes right to the back nice and straight. So the goal with the runners that we put in was so that the drawers would not move around side to side and they couldn't, turn and go on diagonal on that. So with those in, we're all good to go now. We're pretty much done with the drawers and this whole project. So the last thing we need to do is we need to take those off, put a little bit of oil on them, finish them off a little bit. Then the very last thing to do is going to be putting on the bottom panel of these drawers, which I still have not quite decided what I want to do. Initially, I was going to do a frame and panel base of the drawers, kind of like the style we did the shelves. But I've kind of decided against that now because I think that that's not going to work out very well because we only have 3/8 of an inch to play with. And these are already fairly small drawers as it is. I don't think I want to try and make a small frame and panel just because I don't think it's going to work out very well. Alright, so I've got all the components milled for our bottom drawer panels. So we've got our two nice wide, what's going to be the floating panels in these things, and then we've got the pieces that are going to make up our frames. Again, the reason I'm doing this frame and panel is purely because I don't have a planer wide enough to actually cut these pieces down to an equal thickness throughout the whole thing. This is about the maximum I can do. So before we move on to finish sanding, let's talk about the drawer bottoms here. So these are a frame and panel design, just like you guys have seen on the rest of this cupboard. But the problem with them is that they are made in a way that they need to be perfectly flat. If you're putting stuff in the bottom of the drawer, you don't want it catching on little humps and that, so it needs to be nice and smooth. And the only machine that can do that is my planer. Now there's two problems with that. My planer, for one, is not nearly wide enough. This is a 15 and a little bit of inch panel. My planer is only 13 inches, so our first problem's there. The other problem is anytime you're going across the grain with a planer, you can really risk causing a lot of damage to both your machine and the piece of wood. I've tried this a couple times, and even taking very thin passes, it does a massive amount of damage to any cross grain cuts. And so the idea here is to go through with my hand plane and smooth it out. And so I started this process by working with a 25-degree blade in my low-angle jack. this did a good job of breaking all of our edges, getting everything down to a nice flat level. The only problem with a 25-degree blade, especially on curly wood like this, going across the grain and just with how curly this is that it tears out like a crazy amount. And so then once I had everything flattened with the 25-degree blade, I went back in with the 50-degree blade, which you guys saw me use on the drawer fronts, which also had very crazy grains. So by going in with the 50-degree blade, that allowed me to work in whatever direction I needed to, whether I was going across the panel this way or across it that way. It left the same surface finish as, either going either direction. So that's a really good thing anytime you're working with a panel like this. And so now our panels are all nice and flat. I've removed all the tear out from the 25-degree blade. They're nice and well thickness to what I need them to be. And so one downside to a hand plane, and this is mostly just because of my skill level with it, is that it's not a perfectly even panel all the way around. Now, we don't vary nearly as bad as, if I was to just try and sand this thing flat. Trying to sand stuff flat with a palm sander never works out very well. It always, you're always going to get little dishes in that here and there. So something like a low angle jack is much better for flattening. But now I'm going to go in with my sander with a very high grit, 220 grit sanding disc, and I'm just going to clean this up because there are some lines through it that the hand plane leaves. And on our cross pieces on the front and back here, we do have a pretty bad, it doesn't look very nice. It doesn't look anywhere near as nice as the rest of the panel here. So I want to give everything a nice even finish look to it. And that way when I put finish on it, it won't look bad.